I'm Rob.
And I'm Nate.
And welcome back to Rob and Nate Record a Podcast. This will be our final episode, wrapping up the Under the Banner of Heaven series, in which we'll discuss episodes 6 and 7 of the series. I think what Nate was about to say is we've had a recording hiatus due to
vacations and COVID,
illness and vacation, and both of us having traveled. So it's been a little while since we've watched any of the series and recorded. And in the meantime, I've been re-listening to the Jon Krakauer book. So some of the actual events are refreshed in my mind.
Indeed.
Which will end up coming up as we discuss this further. But yeah, we just concluded watching episode 6. Nate, what are your initial thoughts?
I liked especially the early part of episode 6, then less so some of the latter developments. So we'll do what we've kind of done before, which is go roughly chronologically through some of the events of this episode. We start out at the widow Lafferty's house. They have some more conversations about, the case. They talk about the School of the Prophets meeting in the basement.
Well, and I should clarify a couple things before we move on. I've said in previous episodes that the Lafferty father, like the patriarch, was still alive when the murders occurred. I was mistaken. He had passed. They had returned from their mission. And there is a reference in this. They've got Mr. Wright, played by Darren Goldstein, over at the Lafferty family home. And he's talking about how he thinks it's possible that they murdered the patriarch, Mr. Watson Lafferty. And what had happened was he had diabetes that the family decided not to treat by conventional means, that they were going to go like a holistic means for treating it. And even after it was obvious that it was not working, they continued to not treat his diabetes, which led to his death, which is what they're talking about. So Miss Lafferty, I forget her first name, was a widow at the time. They did discuss plans for the murder and stay at her house the night before committing the murders.
Was the School of the Prophets held in their basement, or was it held principally somewhere else?
I don't recall for sure. I don't recall whether the School of the Prophets was actually held in their basement or whether it was held in a different location. There's other things that they're getting out of order here. Like this trip to Oregon did not happen prior to Ron's affiliation with the School of the Prophets. As I've mentioned several other times in other recordings, the School of the Prophets came much earlier and had a significant influence on some of their other stances, the polygamy stuff, the tax stuff. And in fact, Ron Lafferty was the bishop of the School of the Prophets. And he's the one that introduced wine to the School of the Prophets and their sacrament that they would administer. And then it was after... So once in the School of the Prophets, one of the other things we're going to eventually get to is the removal order. In the School of the Prophets, they would actually bring forward their revelations to be presented to the school for approval. However, they never approved his removal revelation.
Okay. They do here.
Yes. And then this trip to Oregon occurred amidst the School of the Prophets. And I think it was after his wife had left him. Ron's wife had left him, had divorced him, and had moved back to Florida. But yeah, they've changed a lot of the order of stuff. This Dream Mine, this City of Refuge, all of this also happened before, some of this started to come.
Well, the show jumps around in time.
Okay.
So they have the investigation narrative, and then they flash back.
Well, but in the series, they're showing him going to Oregon and then coming back to the School of the Prophets and meeting the prophet Onias.
I don't really care about that. I think that's a minor point.
The prophet Onias was significant on their fundamentalizing, and that's why it's relevant.
Okay.
This pamphlet that they're distributing when Ron gets back, he was part of helping write that pamphlet.
Ron was?
Yes, and all of the Lafferty brothers were instrumental in getting it distributed, and they sent it to all LDS congregations in Utah.
Wow.
Throughout the Intermountain West, actually.
It's a great way to draw negative attention to yourself.
Yeah.
So they have that little trip where Ron is searching, and he goes to Oregon and meets John Bryant, prophet president of the Church of the Covenant of Christ. Is this real?
Yes.
Okay. And they're kind of hippie-ish Mormons. And in this, they indicate this is where they got wine from, because they talk about how, well, the word of wisdom came in this context of this temperance movement, and the revelation itself says it's by way of extortion, or it's not by way of commandment. So they drink wine, and Ron apparently likes this, and then engages in a really kind of strange kiss with the prophet John Bryant, comes back, has interactions with the School of the Prophets, is not
And the
so
prophet,
keen
prophet Onias.
with the prophet Onias at first, but goes on to... the prophet Onias himself is content to be kind of a second-in-command figure.
The Laffertys did come to dominate the School of the Prophets to a certain extent, but yeah.
And then they did make a reference earlier that John Bryant was his group is a break-off of the Apostolic United Brethren, or AUB, which is kind of the left wing, to the extent that there's a left-wing group in Fundamentalist Mormonism. They don't do child marriage. They have long cooperated with state authorities on abuse claims. But their prophet, Rulon Allard, who was also a chiropractor, was killed by rivals in 1977, and his funeral, which I want to say they had at Bingham High School, was one of the biggest funerals in the history of Utah up to that time. There's more stuff with Pyrie and his mother and his kids. More Prophet Onias stuff. They go to the Dream Mind. There's a portion, this might be my favorite scene, is when the father-in-law of Alan...
So I got the names wrong earlier.
Okay.
I referred to Mr. Wright as the one that accused the Laffertys of murdering their father. That was
Mr. Brady.
They call Brady in this series. Mr. Wright, played by Darren Goldstein, is Brenda's father. Yeah.
So he comes to visit. There's been some dispute about taking this sick baby to the hospital. Alan didn't want to. Brenda insisted and brought her sister and father down from Idaho to assist, and the two sisters went to the hospital with the baby. The father has a conversation with Alan. They listen to Love Brings Us Up Where We Belong on the radio, and he kind of speaks the lyrics, and I was drinking something at the time, and I almost did a spit take. I mean, it was funny.
Yeah.
And then they eat a cherry cordial, which ironically, I had literally just eaten a cherry cordial. It's a sign, man. It's like, that was weird. I found that, I don't know, I liked that scene. It was so bizarre. But it was neat the way he was trying to common sense his son-in-law.
Well, and there was a truthfulness to that. So
Yeah.
Brenda had reached out to her family, and they were trying to help straighten
Alan
out. There was actually at one point talk of Alan and Brenda moving up to Idaho to be closer to her family, to help separate him from his family. And Brenda, this is another thing that they're changing in the series for a functional purpose, which isn't fully clear yet, but the implication is that they're trying to shift the blame for certain decisions to the church and away from Brenda. Brenda came to the conclusion that they needed to stay in Utah so that she could help Alan save the Lafferty family. So they had actually had plans to move up to Idaho Falls, be close to her family, and then Brenda's the one who decided they needed to stay so that she could help the Laffertys.
This is a little bit of a retread because they'd already talked about that in a previous episode.
Well, but in the series, she meets with people from the Quorum of the 70 who give her a blessing and tell her that she needs to stay and be the one to straighten out the Laffertys.
It's kind of, I mean, they've already kind of covered this territory. And I guess maybe they were wanting to...
What's the function of this?
Put this side, kind of re-emphasize this because it's been several episodes since they'd mentioned it, that she felt this need. You had talked about how they were trying to, Dustin Lance Black seemed to be trying to shift the blame onto the church for his decision. Now, this would be, if I were to make a defense of this, I would say, well, this is a means of communicating to a largely non-LDS audience what in reality is more abstract pressure that she would have felt to stay and make things work by putting it in the mouths of church authorities. I agree. It's kind of. I'm not sure if I like that. How much I like that, or how
it doesn't function for me. Like, we're already in this series talking so heavily about the effects of like personal revelation on this Lafferty family. And yet we're supposed to believe that Brenda can't get the same level of personal revelation without church intervention. You know, it's not...
Well, they're presenting her as taking a much more orthodox position and going out of her way and doing things like bringing in the bishop early on and bringing in now the 70 to try to use that institutional authority to nudge. Like, they also have the sequence where she's trying to nudge the siblings back into activity by doing things to make them concerned that their wives might leave them. So she gets some missionaries to come around to
which is also not accurate. But so there's parts of this are accurate and parts of it aren't. Brenda was acting, trying to get the sisters to help their husbands, and things like that. The bishop did help Ron's wife.
Brenda. No, not Brenda.
No.
Diane.
Yeah. So the bishop and Brenda did help Ron's wife, Diane. So her main concern in leaving Ron was that she had no marketable skills. Ron and Brenda met when Ron was a missionary in Florida, and then married right after his mission. Brenda had never had a job. She'd never had any functional skills. So her concern in leaving Ron was that she didn't have any marketable skills. So the church helped her and supported her, both the bishop and the stake president, in filing for divorce from Ron. Ron and Dan at this point have both already been excommunicated from the church because of their affiliation with the School of Prophets and things that they were doing in terms of polygamy. Both had already been excommunicated from the church, and then they help her pay for the divorce, file for divorce, all of that type of stuff, which is why the bishop and stake president were included in the removal revelation, and Brenda as well. So it was Brenda, the bishop, and the stake president that helped Diane leave Ron, and Diane at this point is already back in Florida with her family.
Okay.
But this is the context of how Brenda, the bishop, and the stake president end up in the removal order, which there's reference to in this series, but they name Diane as someone that needs to be removed, not Brenda, not the bishop, not the stake president.
Well, we're see, this is the multiple timelines causing confusion, because we see a moment where they're at the School of the Prophets, and Ron gives this revelation about Diana, but in the timeline of the investigation, they become aware of the hit list, the removal order, and then they go around and they visit the bishop, and the homes of the bishop, the stake president, try to warn him.
Well, my understanding of the timeline of this episode is that this is all after they've already... others have gone and warned people, particularly Matilda Lafferty, which some of the wives had warned some of the people involved in trying to help Diane that they were possibly in danger through subtle means. But in terms of this series, and when that's being presented, this has all happened after the Oregon trip. They're also learning about the removal order revelation through the letters that Brenda has written to her sister.
Yeah, but they're already aware of it.
They're aware of the removal order, but now they're getting more clarification.
They're getting clarification about it, but that they were aware of it. When there's a silly line where Brenda talks about saying the missionaries a couple of hunks.
Yeah.
To remind them about the church, and then they have that the conversation with the missionaries are funny. The extent of the humoring of the missionaries, because these are young guys. They're being asked to save the souls of to save these women, basically.
Yeah.
Which is beyond their capability. They give it a good faith try, but that they don't have any success. I love the conversation. I think this is the second time where they've talked about capitalism as part of Heavenly Father's plan. And then one of my favorite lines is when they confront the one Scottish sister-in-law, and she comes to Brenda's home to deliver a warning because she had sent the missionaries with some store-bought goods for her sisters-in-law
Butter.
Because their husbands were making them churn their own butter and kind of do things this old-fashioned way because they had this idea that the store-bought stuff was bad. But
which was truthful.
The line I want to get to is when she comes to the house and accuses Brenda of trying to buy our sisters back into a corrupt church through store-bought butter.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the great lines of this thing.
It's interesting which things he's choosing to keep, or the showrunners in general are choosing to keep, and which ones that they are intentionally twisting, misleading, or completely changing.
They kind of break in threes as they're investigating. Taba goes up to the dream mine, ends up meeting Onias. That's kind of where they end that storyline in this episode. They send one of the junior cops, and eventually Pyrie joins him to the 7-Eleven, because there was a 7-Eleven robbery, some shoplifting that appears to have been done by one of the Lafferty brothers. I love that it's a 7-Eleven, because Utah is crammed to the gills with these things, and was even more so in the 1980s. And then Pyrie goes back home, and he's had that conversation with...
Well, but he's scared because this 7-Eleven is just
close,
blocks from his house, and the direction that the Lafferty brother who committed the shoplifting fled to is into the neighborhood where he lives. And then Detective Pyrie pulls out the book.
Yeah, pulls out the book. So he had that discussion with Alan, and Alan had talked about doing some church history research and had used a book that he had put in the cover, under the cover of a woodworking textbook, which ended up in the evidence file. And so Pyrie takes that out of the evidence file, takes it home, has it in his office. For some reason, decides not to read from it in his office, where it would seem normal that he's reading the book, but takes it into the garage and is reading from a book, and that book is Mormonism, Shadow or Reality, 1963 by Gerald and Sandra Tanner. One of the, I guess you could say, classics in the anti-Mormon genre. The 20th, one of the possibly the most iconic 19th century or 20th century anti-Mormon book, other than maybe some of the Ed Decker stuff. But he's out reading that, and his wife comes in and sees him, and he basically says, "I'm having some problems." And she's like, "Well, I can't go. I love you, but I can't go through this with you, and I'm going to need you to do me a favor. I'm going to need you to bear your testimony to our congregation so that our girls know that their father still believes."
Yeah.
And that's where they leave that episode off, and where the show continues to show its interest in being a faith crisis narrative.
Yeah. And I'm kind of curious to see where they're going to go with it. I've got some issues with some of the choices, again, the things that they're choosing to obscure, the timelines they're choosing to change, some of the things that they're just full-on intentionally shifting. What is the function of those changes, and how's that going to resolve in the final episode?
I think most of them are just for, I mean, that's what you do when you adapt something. You take liberties. Now, there are some exceptions.
What is the function of some of these liberties?
I think that the meeting with the 70, I mean, I think that's really adding a pretty significant something that's not in the text, and that gives an impression that is not borne out by actual events, and so I do have a problem with that. But a lot of these minor things about changing the order of time frames don't really bother me. I think they're very minor points.
Like I said, I think it is relevant simply to the fact that it is relevant that these guys had fundamentalized before they went this direction. This direction did not come about in the mainstream church, which I think it's intentional that they're trying to imply that this is more mainstream than it is.
Well, you're talking about
the perversion of their beliefs.
So what specifically?
Like their beliefs in the plural marriage stuff, all of that, it's less common in the mainstream church than it is in the fundamentalist church.
Oh, yeah, of course it is.
Yeah, but he's intentionally... my opinion is they're changing the timeline to make it appear as though they went through some of these things while still in the mainstream church to make it seem more mainstream than it is.
Well, you do have some of that. Once the church, there's people that come from the mainstream LDS church and go fundamentalist, which is what the Laffertys did. Once that the mainstream church becomes aware of it, discipline is all but instantaneous. And I get that. It's very important to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to draw a distinction between them and the fundamentalist offshoots, and that a story about mainstream members, they get involved in that, tends to blur that, and they don't like that. And a lot of members of the church don't like that. They don't like that blurring, but in this particular case, this really happened. That these people that were mainstream LDS got radicalized and splintered off.
Yeah, which has happened a bunch in the history. Yeah. But they're making, in the series, they're making it appear as though it's more mainstream than it is.
I'm not sure if I'm not sure how much I agree with you on it, but I understand. I mean, the series does take time to talk about the different types of Mormons and kind of the different degrees, and we see different type of Mormons. It is overwhelmingly on they're kind of nasty, they're kind of weird end of the spectrum, even some of the mainstream ones. Oh, yeah. But that bishop that helps Brenda he's a good guy.
Yeah.
And there's a number of other people that are legitimately good people that are depicted as mainstream LDS in this series.
Yeah. Like I said, I'm curious to see where some of this goes. Again, my biggest gripe is about turning this into a faith crisis storyline as opposed to and creating drama around that as opposed to it's already dramatic enough, so in my opinion. So there is some sketchy stuff around the mom of the Laffertys that, like, they're talking about the possibility of arresting her and prosecuting her as a accomplice, which
I think they were just trying to scare her to get her to talk.
Well, I haven't seen any evidence that like that threat was made, but it seems also very plausible that that threat was made because, again, so the murders occurred on Pioneer Day, and the brothers had returned to Provo and were at her house the 22nd and 23rd of July before going out and committing the murders on the 24th, and discussed what they were going to do in her home with her nearby.
It's also of some interest to point out that the implication I got while watching this, especially early episodes, well, I mean, it's a Friday when the murders happen because they have church 2 days later. But that's not actually the time frame. July the 24th, 1984 was Tuesday.
Yeah.
So, again, more liberties.
Yeah. And the only other thing I don't know that it's particularly relevant to point out, is in this series, Detective Pyrie and Detective Taba find the barrel of the shotgun in the Lafferty home. The Laffertys did cut down a shotgun to take with them as they committed these murders. However, they took the barrel with them to use as a club to club Brenda, which they ended up not using in that way, but they did take the barrel with them. So again, there's no real function in changing that other than just, again, alluding to what the brothers are about to do.
So your complaint is, why did they bother to roll out the barrel?
Wow. Should have saved that for the outtake. All right. We'll be back after we watch episode 7. We're back. Episode 7. First reactions to episode 7, Nate.
First reactions to episode 7. That's a mixed bag.
Indeed.
As I think this whole thing has been, and which we'll get into in more detail.
Yeah, we're going to get into this in detail, I'm sure, as we go through the episode, so why don't you lead us?
Okay, so the investigation continues. Very early on, we have a fun visit at the police station from Elder Palpatine of the Quorum of the 70. Last seen in the previous episode, meeting in conjunction with several others and Brenda and Alan. He has arrived to put pressure on Detective Pyrie to just keep this whole thing as quiet as possible for public relations purposes. He proceeds to be a 19th century stock villain and to thank
Detective Taba
for his Paiute ancestors' help in the Mountain Meadows Massacre.
Yeah.
Which, as I saw him moving in that direction, I'm like, don't you dare thank him. Oh, dang it.
Yeah.
He also basically does a kind of a gangster thing. It's like, you got a nice eternal family there,
it'd be a shame for
Pyrie. It'd be a shame for you to lose it.
Which Detective Pyrie's already said that the brethren are going to take his wife and kids away from him, like we were living in. Yeah,
Pioneer era Utah. We have a flashback to Pioneer, Utah to talk about the Mountain Meadows Massacre, which has been alluded to before. So the Mountain Meadows Massacre is... I can't remember how much have we talked about this before. It's been a while since we recorded.
We've talked about it a little bit, but not tons and tons.
But not in any real detail. So, Mountain Meadows Massacre. So the church heads out to Utah, 1846, 1847. 10 years after they have settled there, there's rumors about insurrection, and they don't really go into this part of it, but there's... In the same year, and I forget the order, this probably happened earlier, there's the federal army was going to Salt Lake City, and around the same time...
The massacre occurs before that.
Okay. Yeah, but it's not too far, because this was in September. This was in September of 1857. There's a pioneer train going through southern Utah. It is composed of Missourians and Arkansans. Of course, Missouri, there was the persecutions in Missouri, and earlier that same year, LDS Apostle Parley P. Pratt had been murdered in Arkansas. So these people are from areas where the church has had trouble. It's like the amount of things that had to line up to make this event happen is crazy, because you have people from this particular area at this particular tense time with these particular leaders in southern Utah, and a decision is made to massacre them with the aid of Paiutes, who the church was relatively friendly with. Brigham Young said it's easier to feed the Indians than to fight them. So they generally were on pretty good terms with the local Indians. But the plan appeared to have been to blame the Indians for this massacre of the Pioneer Company. There is much dispute about if Brigham Young knew about and or ordered this. I tend to think he did not, for a number of reasons. But certainly local church leaders were heavily involved in this. And many years later, one of them, John D. Lee, was killed on the same spot of the massacre after being found guilty of it. A lot of people feel he was scapegoat.
which kind of was. He was involved, but he was kind of the fall guy for what a bunch of people were involved in.
The conventional narrative is that Brigham Young did have knowledge of it, that he was, if he didn't order it, didn't condemn it, but the involvement of the Paiutes was essentially, the conventional narrative is that they were basically splitting the loot with the LDS people in the area, and so the motivation for the Paiutes to be involved in this was that they would get half the horses and other things.
They killed like 130-something people in
Quite
this
a few
wagon
people,
train.
and
They left a small number of young children under like 6.
well, and they left all of the bodies there. Like, yeah, there was talk of years later you could go there and find bones and things. And
This
was Detective Taba's involved? Like, the character of Detective Taba only involved in this show for the purpose of this?
That's a large part of it, but also to get that the Lamanite perspective for, that's an interesting contrast there, to have an Indian there with the faithful Mormon detective, and also to be a
It
secular
just feels
voice.
disingenuous. I mean, the secular voice, yes, I like that. Having Detective Taba there to offer the Native American version of it seems disingenuous, but that's
I didn't have a problem.
I
with
like the Detective Taba character.
That was a means of saying, hey, there's different versions of this story.
okay. I mean, I can see
and
that.
I'm fine with it. He did get a little heavy-handed at times with Pyrie, kind of blaming him. And this is another thing that kind of goes into the, I think of the narrative of the time where the book came out, the post 9/11, and you had a lot of criticisms amongst the new atheists of the more nominal, non-fundamentalist religious peoples, like you're just enabling them or emboldening them by supporting this stuff. And so he really goes full on that against poor Pyrie. Doesn't really need that stuff, but he goes off on that for a while.
Yeah.
There's this idea that the religion in general, the church in particular, has this inherent violent streak in it. And when I was going to Boise State University 15 plus years ago, there's an LDS Institute of Religion associated with it. And one day there was this guy who was protesting. He was an evangelical Christian. He was actually British. He was there to spend a few days preaching, I guess, and then to go down to the funeral of Gerald Tanner, he told us, who'd recently passed away. So I could probably date this based on that. But anyway, he was handing out stuff about the Mountain Meadows Massacre, and I was trying to converse with him and said, no, do you think this is representative of the... Did I told this story?
I don't know.
So I said, do you think this is representative of the church? Like, yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, what are the other massacres? It's like, this is like the worst thing to like happen in the history of the church, to be directly attributed to church people, and it is all based on a very specific set of circumstances that had to align at the right time for anything like this to happen.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a fluke. And I think
There's
that...
some evidence that the locals were also told that these people in this wagon company were involved in the murder of Joseph Smith, that they were involved in the persecutions of the saints, other things to rile the locals up.
Yeah. But you had to have the amount of the sense of persecution at that particular time with the federal pressure. You had to have this wagon train of people from this particular part of the country going by this particular town at this particular time with this particular zealot leadership. I mean, a lot of these things, just slight changes in the time frame of things, or the composition of the wagon train, could have meant that nothing would have happened.
Yeah.
Jeb, for some reason, takes his 8-year-old daughter's journals and is reading through them.
On this trip to try and track down Dan and Ron.
Yeah, so they find Diana. So they figure out that Diana's gone to Florida because that's where she was going to nursing school when she met Ron, who she later married, and that Brenda probably would have encouraged her to go back and do that. And so there's
also, they say in this series that she was from New Jersey, but she was actually from Florida.
Oh, okay.
So she went back there because it was closer to her family.
I think they wanted this idea that she didn't have a family structure there, that she didn't have support mechanisms, so she might flee.
Yeah.
Is what they were trying to do with that. But anyway, they end up they figure out that that's where she is. They contact authorities in Florida, and they have this woman, Latina police detective. Again, more diversity, more contrast to the whiteness in
and they did
Utah.
send people to do a welfare check on Diana. Mm-hmm. They did put her and the children into protective custody because
Once
they didn't know where
them.
Ron and Dan were. Yeah. There was not that in reality there was not that big of an effort to find her. They found her sooner than that.
Pretty though. Okay. And then once the children were in custody, Diana leaves to rescue her sisters and head back to Utah. That's not historically accurate. Okay, it's dramatic effect. We meet Ricky and Chip, the two good time guys that...
So this goes back to the actual timeline.
Okay.
So Ron and Dan had left. So after Diana divorced Ron, they went on this trek, and Dan had been making visits to various fundamentalist areas and had taken multiple wives already. And then Ron and Dan go on this extended road trip where they go through the middle U.S. They go to like Missouri and other places like that. There's some speculation that they could have had an intention to go to Florida. They never do. In fact, at one point they actually separate and then reunite at a designated meeting place. I don't remember where they reunited, but as they were doing that, they met up with Chip and Ricky. And they join band with them and start smoking a bunch of marijuana. At first, it's just really cheap marijuana. Like one of either Chip or Ricky had worked at a marijuana farm, and they went back and picked up the tailings, like the buds had already been cut off, so it was really weak weed. They start smoking that, and then they get higher grade weed. And then they return to Utah, like I said, either on July 22nd or 23rd, go back to the Lafferty family home. That's where they're there with the mother, which is portrayed in this episode, but not in a historically accurate manner. Saw off the shotguns and then carry out the plan on the 24th. They do go to Brenda's home. Ron goes to the door. She doesn't answer. They're leaving when Dan is driving, and Dan gets the impression that he should turn around and go back to the home. And Brenda then doesn't answer. The murders are then carried out. However, it's not quite how it's portrayed in this episode.
We do more or less. I mean, we don't see the moment of. We see up to the moment of the murder. Basically.
So there was like they did beat her up. Ron was hitting her. They let her up at one point though. When we're talking to her, she tries to flee to the back door, and that's when they tie the cord around her neck. It wasn't to make sure that she was dead. They tied the cord around her neck to make sure she didn't get up and try and run again, while Dan went in and killed the child first, and then Dan came out and killed Brenda.
And the child is Erica. I think
Yes.
we may have forgotten to mention that earlier. So it's Brenda and Erica.
But Ricky and Chip were in the car. They actually so Ron and Dan confessed to the crimes, and the telling of the crimes between Chip, Ricky, Dan, and Ron, there are slight differences. Ricky and Chip said that there was a lot of screaming, that they were sitting in the driveway and could hear yelling from inside the house. They got scared, so they actually started the car and backed it into the street, but decided to wait for him. Dan and Ron claimed that it was peaceful inside the home, that it was relatively quiet, but it was quite a bloody scene. When they get back in the car, they do have quite a bit of blood on them. Ricky and Chip complained about the odor of the blood. They then go to the Lowe's home. This is the actual history. They go to the Lowe's home. No one's home, and then they miss the turnoff to the stake president's home, and then they just drive away. Ricky and Chip do end up stealing the car from Dan and Ron and fleeing, and are caught, and they've discarded the clothing, the knife, those types of things along the roadway, but I don't believe they ever made it back to either of their homes in Wyoming. That's kind of manufactured for no particular reason that I could see in this series.
Yeah, but it was interesting to finally more or less see the murder.
Yeah.
And I actually think that worked, kind of holding that off to the end and getting the context and the true terror of it. And they give Brenda a really kind of noble defense at the end as she tries to protect her daughter, and
she was trying to protect her daughter.
Damns them, but uses, she damns them. It's like I will be whole again, and you will not be.
Yeah.
You will be cast into outer darkness. I mean, what else can she do in a situation like that? And just kind of lay a big truth bomb, I guess.
Yeah.
And see
and the day that the murders occurred, Alan was on the 24th. Alan was up at he did have a tiling job, which is portrayed in this episode, and he was working at a job up in Ogden. Had called Brenda, which is portrayed in this episode, and had spoken to her and returned home about 8 o'clock, and that's when he discovered the bodies.
And in some of the conversations that they later have with Alan, he talks about having kind of arrived at this kind of place of peace. It's like, oh, well, I don't believe in the church anymore, but I believe in my marriage. And this is what I am committed to, and I'll do what I have to do for it and screw my family. And unfortunately, that doesn't work out because of the murder. There's a scene where they're trying to track down the brothers, Ron and Dan, who are having an increasing... That relationship is getting after the murder, I mean, they both want to be number one, and they go off on this number one thing that's a little
Which
bit
is I haven't
silly
seen anything
logic
that actually supports
from
that.
how he figures this out based on this. I do like how they have that conversation out when they're looking for the murder weapons. Ricky and Chip have told them where we dumped them, and they're having that conversation. And Pyrie's like, "Well, I don't know. Didn't they both say they're atheists? It's like, how can we trust them?" So they have a little kind of digression on that. And Taba says, "Well, they're not like your, unlike your intermittently compassionate people or ancestors." Or your intermittently compassionate ancestors have an allergy to the facts,
Yeah.
but the atheists don't,
Yeah.
because we want to drop that point here, because we're making points.
Yep.
Says Dustin Lance Black. They go to Reno. They tell this girl Sandy, who may have been a mistress / plural wife of one or both of the Laffertys. It appears to have been Dan that was principally involved with her.
That's not fully clear. She did get them like meal vouchers.
She's a real person.
And they did
I
like kind of stay with her. Yeah, she is
Yeah.
a real person. She took them in. They were staying at her house. She was getting the meal vouchers. They were gambling a little bit to pay for other meals. Previously, earlier in the episode, the thing where they sent one of the brothers to Nevada to bet on a horse race, that was true, but that occurred much earlier, and it was they believed he was going to win the bet to get money to further the Dream Mine and the City of Refuge at the base of
Have
the
we
Dream
talked
Mine.
much about the Dream Mine?
No, and I don't know that we need to.
Well, the Dream Mine is this.
I think there's some stuff in the Old Testament about treasures getting hid up and like moving in the mountains so that people can't find the treasures. And then this also corresponds with folk beliefs related to the treasure digging that Joe Smith was involved in upstate New York.
It gets far more specific. There is someone who had a dream in which the angel Moroni came to him.
But it's born out of this
Yeah.
background. Yeah.
But I forget who the individual is that has the dream.
They describe him as having been an LDS bishop like 100 years earlier.
Yes, but I forget his name. Moroni supposedly flies him to Utah into a mountain deep underground where he is shown the remainder of Mormon's records in the mountain. Mm-hmm. And that there's other riches buried there, as you've alluded to. And then there's this belief that the mine and the riches are going to be discovered just before the latter days and will be used to help build a city of refuge for the saints to hide and to defend themselves in the latter days.
Which they describe as being under the mountain?
No, but it was the city of refuge was supposed to be at the base of the mountain.
At the base of the mountain.
And the mountain, the Dream Mine was supposed to be located in Salem, Utah, which they accurately describe in the series, even though that they haven't placed East Rockwell or choose to create a fictional town for the rest of it. But then they accurately detail that Salem is the location of the Dream Mine and that the city of refuge is just outside of the city of Salem.
And this is a thing that it's like a treasure hunt thing. People have periodically tried to find and or operate this mine over the years.
But it comes back to the School of the Prophets and Prophet Onias, because Prophet Onias was a big stockholder in the Dream Mine, and the School of the Prophets had collected money for shares in the Dream Mine to expand the Prophet Onias' holdings. Dan and Ron tried to take over the operation of the Dream Mine at one point. Again, this is all tied back to the School of the Prophets and before they go on this road journey. So while some of this is relevant to the story, it's not accurately portrayed in the timeline of this story.
We have the confrontation between Diana. So Diana goes back to the
Family home, the Lafferty home.
Finds that
Matilda.
Matilda has been hiding there, takes Matilda, says we need to get out of the state, and they stop for gas, and it just so happens that the Rory Culkin Lafferty and his wife are there, and they have a confrontation. And they make a point of showing all these people, including a Boy Scout leader and some Boy Scouts, just basically do nothing when she's crying for help. It's like, you got to get her away from this guy, he's bad. And
From Samuel Lafferty.
From Samuel. And so they have a confrontation. Samuel and his wife drive away, but Matilda and Diana make their way out of state. They then contact Diana's family back in Florida. And that word eventually gets to Pyrie and Taba.
Yeah.
And then they have that, I guess the final confrontation is the brothers are trying to kill each other in the bathroom.
Which also isn't accurate.
Below one of the casinos.
It was at Circus Circus, but in reality, they were arrested on August 7th in in Reno in line for the buffet at Circus Circus.
Well, they make a reference to that because Pyrie talks about watching the buffets when because they've got the local Reno PD, they've got the FBI's been brought in because it's gone across state lines. It's a little bit anticlimactic, that ending.
I don't even understand the function and the point either. Like,
Well,
what
they
is
had
the
to-
function of creating this?
They had to eventually catch them, and I guess they wanted to show, because a theme here has been the deterioration of that relationship, the rivalry of those brothers.
Which didn't occur.
They didn't have a rivalry.
No.
Interesting. Again, I'm fuzzy on those details.
Yeah.
But yeah, they really like this idea of the one, borrowed from Highlander, apparently. But they really, that's one of a number of themes that they really want to play up. The way they end it, and I actually thought they set this up fairly well, is they're getting ready to leave the hotel, and Taba's talking to Pyrie and talking about, sings this little Indian song that he knows from childhood that's supposed to invoke supernatural powers.
Protections or
Protections for the Paiute people. And Pyrie says, well, it's like, do you believe that? It's like, well, I think it's okay to sing it now and then, even if I don't think it has any power, and that everybody needs a home. And basically says, go home, Jeb. I know your whole worldview's been in crisis, but just go home. And so he goes home, sees his daughter, sees his wife, and they had a really bad fight before he went. It basically all but threatened divorce, threatened to leave him.
Well, supposedly his wife, Miss Pyrie,
Played by non-union Abby Cornish.
Adelaide Clemens, Rebecca Pyrie, has told Jeb, because he's leaving to go on this trip, and she's afraid she thinks he's going to be gone for fast and testimony meeting, and he can't bear his testimony, and that means that he doesn't want to, that he's doing it on purpose, and that. So she basically tells him, I'm going to leave you, I'm going to get a divorce, and I'm going to go marry somebody else who's faithful.
Yeah.
She actually says, I married a faithful man to raise my family with, and I will do that whether it's you or someone else.
But things have blown over somewhat, they've largely blown over by the time. I mean, these are things said in the heat of anger.
Yeah, but he returns home to his family, and
They have family prayer, and then he takes his mom out to see a lake. And the kind of the theme, the note that it leaves on is, I'm here for my family, and I'll just kind of play pretend about my belief because I love my family.
Well, and because he can recognize enough miracles in life,
Yeah.
in the existence of the world.
I thought that ending, from kind of things that I'd heard, I expected it to be more heavy-handed than that. I actually
liked the ending.
the ambiguity of it.
Yeah, I like that closing conversation with Pyrie and Taba. I thought that was really effective. I really like the Detective Taba character. I just think he's a really effective character. Andrew Garfield, his character and his portrayal is excellent.
They're a highlight of the show, is those two together. In that,
Well,
that
they do a
relationship.
great job of carrying out what they're given. I just disagree with some of what they were given.
So, since we've basically talked through it, should we talk about
The series
closing
as a whole?
thoughts or the
Yeah.
series as the whole?
What are your thoughts on the series as a whole? Would you recommend this?
That is the question, isn't it? I've gone kind of back and forth on it. It's very close. It's very borderline. I would probably not recommend it,
Yeah.
and I thought I would going into this.
I would tell someone, if you are interested in seeing it, watch it.
Yeah,
If you're not interested in seeing it, don't bother.
Yeah.
However, I would encourage anyone who watches the series and has not read the book to go back and read the book.
Yeah, I would definitely recommend the book as much
Most
superior.
of the series does a disservice to Brenda Lafferty and Erica Lafferty, who are the victims of this story. It's episode 7 does do them some justice.
Yeah.
It's a little bit. It's not quite enough, and it's a little late. But it's, it is a better portrayal. It does make much of the episode about Brenda and Erica. Not all of it, which is okay. They had to wrap it up. But they're the true victims in this, and I don't understand the functional reasons of why they needed to create additional drama, additional victims, and portray some of the things the way they did, because the actual facts were dramatic enough.
I think one major reason why is because it's 7 episodes. And there is an extent to which this feels kind of padded and stretched. They could have done this in 4 episodes.
I would have been fine with 5 or 6, but I would have preferred that they stuck to the actual narrative. Like, why did we need to invent some of these narratives? What was the function in inventing or manipulating some of the narratives?
I didn't. So a lot of the tiny little things, like switching the order of some things around, simplifying some things, I have no problem with that. The things that I have more of a problem with is like Elder Palpatine.
Yep.
And some of these other
credited
things
simply as general authority.
Yeah.
And his portrayed by Frank Moore, and as we've referred to as Elder Palpatine, and he really looks like a real
he talks
Star Wars
with one
villain.
of these and he freaking dusts his
feet.
his feet on them when as he's leaving the office. I mean, it's ridiculous. I think we both kind of laughed when he did that because it was just so over the top.
Yeah.
There is a lack of balance on some things here. Again, it does go out of its way. It shows some good Latter-day Saint people, but they are definitely the minority in this depiction.
Well, again,
most
but like
of them are
like
kind
that
of
whole depiction. What was the function of it?
Yeah, it's a little bit of an axe to grind. I mean, he doesn't like church leaders, and so here's an a-hole church leader for my thing.
Which was portrayed effectively, but I don't see the need for it when everything was dramatic enough.
Yeah.
This has been my whole gripe the whole time. I feel like the story as it was dramatic enough, and we didn't need this invented stuff.
He's using this as a vehicle to tell this story and also to make some points, and I think some of the points he was just overly heavy-handed on.
Yep.
And this is a problem I had with Big Love as well. It's just sometimes it just went a little too far. It's just a little too.
I guess part of what I'm trying to say is, I talked about clear back in episode 1 that Utah County, and especially these small towns in Utah County, are a character into themselves, and these towns are a character in the story of what actually occurred. And I would have rather seen a more accurate portrayal of Utah County and how that functioned in the actual narrative of the story than the manufactured stuff. So, if you want to create a condemnation of the church or of Utah County Mormons, there's ample amount there, and I didn't think the manufactured stuff was A, effective, or B, necessary. Again, so I'm jumping ahead slightly. I would probably give this 5 out of 10 on the 10-star scale. Probably just 1.5 on the 4-star scale. Again, I would say if you're interested in watching it, go for it, but I would encourage anyone who watches the series to eventually read the book.
I'd have a real hard time even rating it on those scales. I mean, there's some episodes that I thought worked really well, and there's some episodes
Episode 7 would
all.
definitely be ranked higher in my mind. I think it was episode 3 also was more effective.
I think episode 4 I remember quite liking.
There was one that had a lot of interaction between Pyrie and Tabit, and that's when this series really excels.
Yeah, that was fun.
Yeah. And I mean, genuinely, that's when this series excels, is when you have the interactions between Andrew Garfield and Gil Birmingham as Detective Taba. When you have interactions between those two, this really excels. Some of the other stuff, not as much.
And it's a little sad that one of the highlights is not from the book. One of the most enjoyable things from this is added.
Well, and
to it
again,
as
we
a
needed the
vehicle.
narrators to take us through it, and so I felt like as our narrators through it, they were effective, but just didn't think that the manufactured drama was effective.
It's a real mixed bag.
Do you regret watching this?
No, but I don't think I'm ever going to watch it again. And I don't think I'll ever. I mean, it's just there's a lot of empty calories in this, and it's just a real compelling story, and it's just it feels kind of watered down, and I do feel that it's stretched out. I think the 7 episode thing I think did it a disservice. This would have been better as like a 2-part TV movie with 2 hours each. Like that's the way it should have been.
I wouldn't have had a problem with a 5-episode series, maybe even 6, but you're right, it is long. And episode 7 is a full 90 minutes.
Yeah.
Like, it was long.
Yeah.
So, and they left a lot to wrap up. I wonder if this attempt of Ron to kill Dan is an allusion to what eventually happened in prison. So what happens after the conclusion of the series is they both are in jail awaiting trial, and Ron actually eventually attempts suicide, not Dan. He hangs himself with his shirt. He's discovered in his cell. I believe they actually were celled together, and Dan's the one who discovers him. And he was unconscious, not breathing, with no pulse for at least 15 minutes before he was actually revived. So they were not tried together because they needed time to make sure that Ron didn't have any lasting effects from the suicide attempt. Dan is convicted by a jury. However, the jury is split on whether he should be sentenced to death. So instead, he gets a life in prison sentence. There is speculation that the jury that then tried Ron felt as though they needed to get retribution for the injustice done to Dan, because Dan's the one that actually committed the murders, not Ron. In fact, they actually talk about, in Ron and Dan's telling, they say when they got to the house at one point, Ron went to involve himself in the murders, and that some physical force pushed him away, and that was the message that Dan needed to commit the acts. But yet Ron is convicted of the murders, as he should have been, and was sentenced to death. He chose firing squad, I believe, as his method of execution. He ended up dying of natural causes in prison before his execution, and Dan is still in prison in Utah to this day.
I believe that Dan has been roommates and good prison buddies
With Mark Hoffman.
with Mark Hoffman. Of
At the time of the writing of
the
the book, in the interviews that were conducted for the book, he was cellmates with Mark Hoffman. Intriguing.
I want to listen to their podcast.
Just want to listen to
I
their
feel awful.
conversations.
Yeah, it's just like I want to listen to one of their conversations.
Well, and I don't know if you recall this, but Dan's defense was that he couldn't have been convicted of murder because God ordered the killings. And also, I should clarify on some of this. Part of why they're so worried about Diane in this portrayal in episode 7 is that she's listed in the removal order, when in reality she was never in the removal order. There was only 4 names ever on the removal order. It was Brenda, Erica, Bishop Lowe, and the stake president.
So that was there to keep her part of the story and to keep a sense of tension.
There's enough of a sense of tension when they're looking for these guys and they have no idea where they are. You say, we know they're in Florida, but we have no idea where these guys are. Yeah, we think they might be in danger. You don't need to have them
They like the idea. So they've already killed one Lafferty bride, and the idea that another one and kids are in danger. That's what they were going for. I don't have a huge... See, that's where a place where we disagree. I don't...
I mean, it doesn't
I'm
have
fine with that.
a net effect on the end other than when they have Deborah leaving her kids and trying to come and rescue Matilda.
There's a little...
The manufactured drama of how
They're
they...
driving across the country.
Well, no, I mean, I was going to say the manufactured drama of them thinking she's on the list. You're right, that doesn't have any net effect. Like, they did send people to look for her because they were worried about her and thought they might be going for her and put her in protective custody until they captured the brothers. That part doesn't have a huge effect.
And it does when it ends. I mean, there's a lot of threads left hanging, like what happened to Rory Culkin in his life. They were last seen.
Well, they claim that Brenda's dad came and picked him up from the station.
Well, no, that's I'm talking about Rory Culkin.
Oh, Samuel.
Samuel, yeah. But they talk about how Alan goes up to Twin Falls, and that's interesting because him and his in-laws had always had kind of a strained relationship, but that's who he had left, and the fact that they would take him in even after the death, I mean, that speaks very well to them.
Well, it seems as though that their relationship had stabilized. Brenda's and Alan's had stabilized. They seem to have been getting along at the time of the murders.
Because love lifts us up where we belong.
Wow.
Where the eagles cry and the mountains sky, and I don't know the lyrics, but it's in Harry and the Hendersons.
Yeah. IMDb shows the series getting an aggregate score of 7.5 stars. Individual episodes have different ratings. The highest rated episode on the series is episode 7.
I'd probably give it a 6 or 7 on the 10-star and a 2.5 on the 2-star. And I feel, part of me feels bad doing that. And I think one of the things that people have, there's a lot of people that really like this, and the fact that it showed a faith crisis on screen was important to a lot of people. A lot of people really responded to that.
Yeah.
And I think there's that representation aspect of it.
Well, and I think that is fair. Like, that could have happened. Someone investigating this case could have had a real faith crisis in this 2-week investigation trying to find these brothers and get them arrested for the crimes. That could have happened. I just didn't see the need for some of the digressions and changes.
They heavy-handed it.
Yeah.
I mean, they just made Elder
like
Palpatine.
Elder Palpatine, the standoff at the cabin, things of that nature. Yeah.
So it's a mixed bag. We would both say it's up to you.
Yep.
Recommendation-wise.
I mean, like I said, if you have an interest in watching it, watch it.
But
consume the book for the better version.
Yeah.
Yep.
In and of itself, as entertainment, it's fine. Yeah, as an examination of this subject matter, it's flawed.
or even as an examination of the faith. If you wanted to view the book as an examination of fundamental Mormonism, I think it does a pretty accurate portrayal. I don't think this one does. It's doing too much straddling the line of the fundamentalism and mainstream, whereas I think the book is pretty clear on what, delving on the fundamentalist.
Yeah, and the book also tells the Elizabeth Smart story and some other stories.
Well, how that connects again to the
Yeah.
fundamentalism and extremism, and yeah. I think if you wanted a vehicle to tell the story of mainstream Mormon extremism, as you alluded to in a previous episode, the Bundy story probably would have been a better story to latch onto. Anything else?
No, I think we said what we have to say.
I'm Rob.
Not me.
And this is Rob and Nate Record a Podcast. What? Go for it. Now Scott says pet me. You ready for this?
Going to God's country, gonna eat a lot of peaches.
Going to God's country?
God's country, because they got peaches at the beginning.
Yeah. I thought the song just said go into the country, gonna eat a lot of peaches.
But I am revising the lyrics.
Okay. All right.
He's digging for the dream mine, she is.
It's going to sound great on the recording.
Mm-hmm.
You ready?
Yeah.
I'm Rob.
Well, we already did this thing.
Oh, duh.
So there was something else I was going to say about Mountain Meadows, but I seem to have lost my train of thought on that one.
The bodies left in the field, Paiutes, fodder for the chopping block.
Oh, okay. So
This myth, this idea of...
Let me grab my charger real quick. Sorry. Keep going.
So there's this mine... How do you even approach this thing? How do I pause it?
When I get back. Hold on.
I made a movie back in 2007 about the Mountain Meadows Massacre. It's called September Dawn.
Mm-hmm.
And it stars...
I'm blanking on his name from Batman. Christian Bale.
No.
Rescue Dawn?
September Dawn. Rescue
Oh.
Dawn is a...
Sorry,
Werner
thinking of a
Herzog-
different one.
Is a Werner Herzog movie. September Dawn has...
John Voight.
And...
Trent Ford.
Terrence Stamp in it. Terrence Stamp is Brigham Young, and John Voight is kind of composite Southern Utah leader. Dean Cain is Joseph Smith.
Oh, really?
It is bad. It's really bad. As I said in the actual podcast, this is this uniquely awful event in the history of the church, and someone like a Spielberg, who could show empathy for both sides, not for the people that so much the people that led the attack, as it's like these people have been persecuted and they were afraid that this was happening, blah blah blah. But this thing was in no interest in showing all the Mormons were awful. They were all stuck, and all of the Fancher people, and apparently the Fancher people had been kind of, what's the word, kind of poking the Mormons with a stick a bit before this happened. Obviously the reaction was way, way overboard, but they weren't like the serene, peaceful, saintly, perfect Smurf people that they were in this movie. That movie's bad. That movie's really bad. Nobody's gotten...
Directed by Christopher Cain. I wonder if there's a relation.
Nobody has gotten Mountain Meadows right in film yet.
Yeah. Stepfather of Roger and Dean Cain. And Crescenda Cain, who also is in this movie.
And he was very struck with the fact that the massacre happened on September the 11th.
Oh, really?
And so he was like, it's not just Muslims.
Okay.
Okay.
A love story set during a tense encounter between a wagon train of settlers and a renegade Mormon group.
There is one Mormon that gets to redeem himself by leaving the other Mormons and saying they're awful.
Yeah.
He's the only good Mormon in it because he leads.
Interesting. Come on, Nate. It's been 2 weeks. You have to have another witty outtake for us. Nothing? No. And my dogs are passed out, so they don't even have some sort of noise to make. Did you like my dog cuddling on you as we watch?
Oh, yeah.
Except for when he growled at you because you
Yeah.
tried to move him. Don't let sleeping dogs lie.
Yeah,
mate.
literally. Mm.